Welcome to In Her Voice. My name is Kelly Covert, and I am passionate about helping women live authentically by listening to their inner voice. Get ready to be inspired by women of all walks of life that have set aside their should-bes and not good enoughs and are standing in their true voice, the voice of wisdom that each and every one of us has inside. Hello and welcome to episode 24 of In Her Voice. My name is Kelly Covert and I am an inner voice coach, and I am so excited that you are here today. Thank you for pressing play. I've got an amazing guest for you today. Her name is Andrea Klunder, and she is the producer and host of the Creative Impostor podcast. It's a show all about how to take bold action in your life and work, despite that little voice in your head that says, "Who do you think you are? You can't do that." And I know that I am not the only one that has that voice in my head. And I just love the conversation that Andrea and I dig into in this interview. We really dig into what we mean when we talk about creativity. And it's way deeper than just being able to draw or paint or write. It's so much more than that. Andrea is also the founder of the Chicago Women's Creative Collective, and she's a meditation and yoga teacher for startup companies, creative individuals, and children. Her classes integrate her background in music, theater, and creativity to engage students in a playful experience of peaceful practices. I just love this. She is so interesting. You guys are going to totally love her. Another one of the big topics that we dug into was how to manage risk when it comes to being creativity and when it comes to making choices in general, because all choices require risk, except for the choice to not change. So risk is inherent in change, and that's something that we talk a lot about, and she has a lot of really good tools and strategies to help manage that risk. We also talk about imposter syndrome, and if you don't know what that is, you're definitely going to want to listen to this, and we really dig into that. And we talk a lot about identity and owning who we are and identifying the through line of our life. So instead of creating our identity around all of the things that we do, creating our identity instead around who we are. And it's just such a wonderfully deep conversation. I know you guys are going to love it. And speaking of that, I just want to say thank you to all of you who reached out to me after last week's solo episode on anger. It was one that I almost didn't put out, and my heart just really said, Kelly, this needs to be out there. You're not the only one struggling with this right in this moment. And man, you guys let me know about that. And I just thank you so much. When I get feedback from you guys about how things are resonating with you, or about what you're loving, or about what you want to hear more of, it helps me so much. And it's like a boost to my spirit too, to know that I'm on the right track. And so I really appreciate you. And if you haven't listened to that, you can go back after you listen to this one, and it's a shorty, but a good one. And you will love that conversation on anger. So let's get right into this episode with Andrea Klunder on creativity. Andrea Klunder, I am so excited to have you on In Her Voice today.
Thank you, Kelly, for having me.
You're so welcome. As I mentioned in your little bio piece before, you have a podcast called The Creative Impostor, which I adore. I've been listening to it and discovering all kinds of new things and new people. And so I really want to encourage everyone to go straight over after you're done listening to this one and hit subscribe so you can check out Andrea's podcast. But I wanted to start with this idea of creativity. And we'll start simple, and I have a feeling that we'll dig deep. So why don't we start with, what does creativity mean to you?
So I define creativity pretty broadly. I grew up in a family where we were encouraged to try new things and to join clubs and to be in choir and to take dance lessons or whatever impulses that we had as children. My parents would always try to give us opportunities to follow those impulses. And as a result, I grew up with a pretty broad understanding of what creativity is in terms of both the arts, which I think we naturally think of, writing, etc., but also just the way that we approach anything that we do. And so creativity for me can be cooking. Creativity can be a way that we approach business or entrepreneurship. Creativity can be a way that we create community in our lives. And so there's a fairly broad definition of what that is, but it's something that I grew up with as a part of life, as something that is not separate from anything else that we do. And so I think that creativity simply is taking the impulses that we have internally to experiment, to try things, to start things, to make things, to look at what already exists and ask how we can do things differently or how we can tweak it or how we can change it, and then following through on that in a process.
So what would you say to the person who says, "Oh, I'm not creative"? Because I'm guessing people say that to you a lot.
Yeah. So it's funny because one of the things that I've created is I have a community here in Chicago where I live called the Chicago Women's Creative Collective. And I use the meetup.com platform to facilitate that community. And I started it really because it was something that I was craving. I was in the midst of my first business that I had ever started. I was working a lot. I had very little energy left over for social interaction and very little time left over for social interaction, but I was craving that. And so I wanted to make a space where I could have that social interaction specifically with other women who are creative and who are taking risks and doing things that are interesting. And I created this little community. At first, it was just a few of my friends who I knew either from my various backgrounds in theater or filmmaking or writing, because I've dabbled in all of those things. And at first, it was just a few of us meeting, and then strangers started joining, and then strangers became community members. But often I'll meet someone and I'll say, "Oh, hey, you should join the Chicago Women's Creative Collective," or "Oh, you should check out our meetup," or "Oh, you should come to this brunch that we're having." And sometimes people will say, "Oh, I don't really know if I'm creative though." And I think that actually everyone has the potential for creativity. I think that it's something that we inherently have as humans, energetically within us, the power to create things. And so when someone says, "I don't know if I'm creative," or "I'm really not creative, I just do accounting," or something like that, I think that it's just that that person is not currently in touch with their own potential for creativity.
Right. I think too, for me, and I consider myself to be a creative person, and I also didn't always think that. Even though I was a musician, I mean, I've been a musician almost my whole life. And despite the fact that in many ways I am what I would now consider to be an artist, I didn't consider myself to be creative because I wasn't writing music or I wasn't painting or whatever. But since then, I've come to realize that creativity goes so much beyond art or physical things that we're making. Like you said, it could be about community. But I really believe that we, by nature, are creative beings. Every single day, we are creating our life. And when I started to look at it in that way, that the life that I'm living is my art. And I get to choose to create it the way that I want to create it through my choices, through my connections, through my interactions with people, through the things that I choose to say. Then that really hit home for me, like, oh, I'm creating whether or not I believe I'm creating.
It's like if you have a thought in your mind and that thought creates, or that thought inspires something that you say, or inspires an action, or inspires a choice, you just created something out of that thought. Like no matter what, the only way you could not be creative is if you just, I guess, if you sat there and had thoughts and never moved and never made a choice and never spoke. I'm not sure. Maybe that.
I think even that you're still creating, because I think we create our thoughts. And that's something that the other beautiful part of that is that we get to choose if we're going to believe those thoughts or act on those thoughts. And that's how we create our life. So I think it's so cool to think of this bigger picture of creativity and how impactful we are as creative beings. And I think the scariest piece of even calling yourself creative or acknowledging that power to create is, like you said, taking risk. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you personally have managed that? Like how did you learn how to be okay with taking those creative risks in your life?
I've had to backtrack and analyze what it is that I do in order to be able to understand my relationship to risk a little better, because I'm somebody who I do things that other people perceive to be risky that in the moment that I'm doing them, I don't think that they're risky.
Gotcha.
And so, for example, I left my full-time office job that I had had for 8 years in 2008, I think, and started my own business. I opened a yoga studio in Chicago, and I had no experience in business. I had taken, I think it was like a 6-week course at the Women's Business Development Center about how to write a business plan and how to do sales projections for your business and things like that, how to do your financials and how to do marketing, but literally like a 6-week course. And I borrowed a lot of money from my parents. I used all of my savings. I maxed out my credit cards. And in the moment that I was starting that project, it felt exciting to me, but it also just felt like the thing that I needed to do next. And I wasn't thinking in terms of, oh, what if this goes wrong? Oh, what if this fails? Oh, what if I lose all my money? Oh, what if nobody comes to my yoga studio? I wasn't really thinking that. I just had this idea in my mind and I created it to the best of my ability. Now, what actually happened is that a few years in, I was not making enough money. I did lose a lot of money. I did lose a lot of sleep. I did lose a lot of energy, and it did not work out the way that I wanted to. And only then did I start to feel like, whoa, why did I take that huge risk? And start to second guess myself and start to recognize what the potential consequences of taking that risk were. Now, even though it didn't work out the way that I wanted it to, would I go back in time and undo that decision? I don't think so. So for me, if you are following your impulses, that inherently means that you're taking risks. And taking risks in a calculated way or in a way that you are consciously making choices around that and having as much information as you can, that is always going to lead to an outcome that creates learning and that creates forward momentum and progression, even if there are setbacks along the way. And so I think that sometimes with risk, we have to make sure that we don't get caught up in overanalyzing things, because then we never take that leap. And so for me, risk taking is a part of every day, and it's a way for us to move forward and fulfill some of those dreams and create new energy and new motion and new momentum in our lives.
Right. And I think what I hear you saying is that there are two different kind of personalities when it comes to taking risk. There's yours, which is you don't actually realize that it's risky until after. And that's also how I am. I have to admit, I just jump in. I just dive in. I'm like, oh, it'll work out. And it's exciting. You're right. And I think I thrive on risk taking a little bit in that sense, although I don't think of it as being risk taking. Mm-hmm. It just feels exciting to me. I'm just making something new. But I think on the other end of the spectrum are people who are so afraid of the risk that they never take the chance. They never even dip their toe in the process of thinking of what it might be like because it's so scary and it's so risky. So what do you say to people like that? How do you manage that feeling of being frozen when it comes to putting yourself out there in creation?
Those are the people that I specifically created my podcast for. And these are the reasons why I wanted to have these conversations and really look at these processes and look at not only the way that I take risks or not only the creative processes that I have, but I wanted to interview other people who I see doing it too, and who I see doing it in different ways, in different fields, in different industries. And the reason is that I want to inspire people who are not the natural risk takers to have the confidence to dip their toe in, to start small. You don't necessarily need to quit your full-time job and invest, $60,000 in starting a new business in order to acquaint yourself with risk. Maybe that's a way to do it. But there are small risks that you can take that you can, it's sort of like building up building a muscle where you can take a risk. Let's say you start a blog. A blog is a pretty low investment in terms of money, and you can start small with just writing short pieces. You can take a risk by signing up for a class to learn something new and seeing where that leads. The size of the risk is not really what matters in the beginning. It's just doing something, anything that takes you a little bit outside of your comfort zone and feeling what that feels like. And then saying, okay, I survived that. It was okay. I was nervous to stand up and read the poem that I wrote in front of a group of people, but you know what? It turned out all right. I'm still here. I'm still breathing. And I have some new energy around that poem or around writing in general. And so I think just taking small steps, surrounding yourself with people who will support you in those small steps is really important. Creating a community for yourself or finding a community to become a part of. And just, you can totally do baby steps. You don't need to jump in over your head right away.
I love that because I think that we can apply that to every aspect of our lives. We can apply that to listening to our inner voice because it's scary sometimes to do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel comfortable. And even that feeling of uncomfortable is another way, just another thing that we could call taking a risk, stepping out of our comfort zone, pushing past resistance. I think that I'm a word person, so I like the idea that we can explain it in a lot of different ways, but what we're talking about is taking a risk. So when you say that you are a creative imposter, what does that mean? Because I actually don't hear you saying that in the way that you're speaking, but that's what your podcast is called. What is a creative imposter?
Okay, so I'm glad that you asked this because I'm still figuring it out. The phrase, the creative imposter, came out of this idea that I knew that I wanted to start a podcast. So this was after I had closed my yoga studio business And I was looking for what's next. What can I do next? I no longer am a yoga studio owner. I'm not that interested in teaching yoga, even though now I do teach yoga again. But for a while, I was not that interested in it. I was burned out. And I was looking for some creative mode of expression that could potentially lead to a new business model. And I had this idea that I wanted to start a podcast, but I didn't know yet what I wanted the podcast to be about. So I was brainstorming ideas and talking with my partner, and I would come up with an idea for something, and I would say to people, oh, I'm going to start this podcast about X. And then they'd be like, oh, that's cool. Like they weren't really interested, or like, oh, great idea. And I'm like, nope, that's not the podcast then, because if no one wants to ask me a question about it, no one's interested, I'm not going to make that podcast. So I was testing different ideas, and I had this thing where I kept hearing about something called imposter syndrome on other people's podcasts and in entrepreneurial blogs and interviews. And imposter syndrome to me sounded terrible. I would say, well, I'm really glad I don't have that, because that sounds terrible. And it sounds like something that prevents people from creating things. But it kept sticking in my mind, this phrase, imposter syndrome, imposter syndrome. And when I really started to investigate it a little bit more, I realized that I do have it, actually, because it shows up every time there's a creative thought in my mind, every time there's an idea about something new. Almost immediately, there's also a little voice that starts telling me all the problems with that thought, all the reasons why it can't work, and I think that this imposter voice got a lot louder after my first business failure, to be honest. Like I took that huge leap. I didn't really pay attention to people telling me, giving me warnings, or are you sure you want to do this, or whatever. But then after that first major failure, the imposter voice got a lot louder and started every time I had an idea saying, but what about this? But this person's already doing this 10,000 times better than you could ever do it. Like, what do you even know about podcasting, or whatever it is? And so I got really curious about this idea of imposter syndrome. And I wondered if everyone who does creative work has it. And I was brainstorming around this with my partner late one night, and I knew that this was the angle that I wanted to take for my podcast, but we needed a name. And I honestly don't remember whether it was him or I who came up with the phrase, the creative imposter, first, but it just popped out. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because creative is what we want, imposter is not what we want. And so we're kind of putting like a positive and a negative together. And there was just something interesting about that phrase. So I started saying to people, hey, I'm launching this show called The Creative Impostor. And all of a sudden the response was more like, ooh, what's that? What's a creative imposter? Tell me more about that. And I thought, yes, this is it. So I created the phrase. And ever since then, I've been trying to decide if the creative imposter is a bad thing that we have to that we have to kind of quiet in order to take our risks and do our work and show up authentically as ourselves and put things out there into the world, or if the creative imposter is actually something to be embraced. And I got that idea from one of my guests, Lisa Black, who was on a while ago, who does heart healing. And she had said to me that when you hear that voice of self-doubt, or that little imposter voice, to rather than try to shut it down or quiet it or say, well, that's fine, I'm going to do it anyway, to actually lean into it and see more, like ask more about what it has to say. Because if you're hearing that voice, then it means that you're onto something really big. Like you're onto something that really could take you in a great direction. And that voice is an opportunity to get really curious about your idea, to get really curious about that thing that it is that you want to do, and to lean into it almost like an ally and explore it more deeply. Because whenever you're doing something new, in a way, you are kind of trying on a persona, or trying on an identity, or trying on a mask in a good way, where it's like, okay, I've never podcasted before in my life, but I'm going to start a podcast. So now I'm putting on this role. I'm taking on this role of podcaster. And in the beginning, I'm not very confident. I don't really feel like I know what I'm doing, but I'm just going to try it anyways. And the more I keep trying it, and the more I keep hearing that voice saying, "What are you doing? You don't know what you're doing," the more I start to embody that role, and it becomes an authentic part of who I am. And I get more and more and more comfortable with it. And that allows me to hone that craft and expand that craft. So I think the creative imposter sort of speaks to that beginning stage where you're just trying something new for the first time and you're stepping into a role that maybe doesn't quite authentically feel like you yet until you've been living inside of that skin for a little while.
Yes. I love what you said about that imposter voice. You call it the imposter voice. Mm-hmm. My listeners know I call it my inner mean girl. Mm-hmm. And man, does she have a noisy mouth. And I think that this idea of leaning into that is so interesting because usually when that voice is popping up, it's because it totally senses that we're about to take a risk and it's trying to keep us safe. And it uses all of that negativity to hold us back and to keep us what it deems as safe, which just means unchanged. And when we start to recognize that all of that popping up is there to, number one, really protect us, to keep us who we are instead of from who we want to be. And then to understand that that is a signal to us that, yes, we're about to grow. We're about to evolve. We're about to step in to something new. Like you said, a new identity. And that to me is very powerful. And I've never heard it explained quite like that, but I really love the idea of leaning in, seeing what she has to say and using that as a tool rather than as something that's going to keep you stuck.
Totally. And it's like, there's all kinds of different ways that that mean girl voice or imposter voice can show up. And I feel like everyone's voice sort of has its favorite tactic that it likes to use. Yeah. Mine is definitely comparison. I get so caught up in, oh my gosh, this person has so many more listeners than me, or wow, their podcast is really amazing. I don't know how I'm ever going to surpass that, or wow, this person has been invited to keynote at 6 different conferences and I've submitted my speaking application 10 times and keep getting rejected. You know, there's always this comparison, but if I can see the comparison come up in my mind, then there's an opportunity there for me to look at the person I'm comparing myself to and see, what is it that I can learn from that person's process that I can adapt and then make my own? So it's giving me, instead of shutting me down, it's giving me more information or an opportunity to seek out more information or to look at something. If someone else's work is triggering me and I'm comparing myself to them, then maybe there's something I can learn from what it is that they're doing that I don't necessarily need to copy, but I can take that in and somehow process that in order to make my work even better.
Right. And then, like you said, that becomes another tool that we have in our toolbox to help us live a life where we're honoring our worthiness every day. And that's what I love to talk about. My listeners know I'm all about what I call everyday worthiness. And I think that this imposter syndrome, this feeling of not enoughness or of comparison or that inner mean girl going all of the time, that keeps us from owning how worthy we are right in this very minute.
And we deflect, right? Somebody compliments us and, you know, and I used to be terrible at this. I was so uncomfortable with taking compliments and positive feedback because I grew up as a performer. I grew up singing. I started singing in my church growing up. I think my first solo at the church, I was like 4 years old or something like that. So I grew up singing and performing. And, you know, in a church environment, you're you're surrounded by a supportive audience, right? Nobody's criticizing your singing in that kind of community. And so people would come up and they'd say, oh, I loved your song. It was so beautiful. And I would get really uncomfortable. Like I would almost try to like avoid seeing people afterwards because I just didn't want to be complimented. And we do that where we deflect. Someone says, wow, I really love your podcast. And you hear yourself saying something like, oh, well, I've gotten really lucky to have really excellent guests. And you just take that compliment and just like deflect it as if you're not owning it. You're not owning the success of what you've created, or you're not owning the value of what you've created. And I think that especially as women, we do that a lot, rather than just simply like standing in that feeling of having created something that's of value for someone else and standing in the worthiness of that and saying, thank you.
Yeah. And I think we need to own it, because we're not doing anyone a favor by diminishing the quality of what we're creating. Mm-hmm. No one is going to benefit from that. And I think that for a long time, women are taught, don't brag about yourself or don't boast because that's going to make other people feel bad. And I don't believe that. I really feel like when we stand in our worthiness, when we stand in our unique qualities that we were put here on earth to give to others, that only shines more light on everyone else. Mm-hmm. So I love that you're saying this. I want to go back to this idea of identity. Mm-hmm. And I want you to take us back to when you had to close your yoga studio down. Mm-hmm. And you've had this identity as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, as a yoga instructor, as a yoga studio owner, all of these things. And then you aren't those things anymore. And you're trying on other hats. But what do you think identity really is? What do you mean when you say that? Who are you?
Oh man, that was the worst. That was the worst struggle when I closed down that business, because I had really taken on that identity, like you said, of entrepreneur, 1, yoga studio owner, 2, yoga teacher, 3. Those were things that were important to me, and that, you know, we constantly define ourselves by what we do in our society, right? You meet somebody new. Hi, I'm Andrea Klunder. Oh, nice to meet you. What do you do? I have a podcast. It's called The Creative Impostor. You know, like we're constantly, even when you're a little kid, people say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And nobody says, oh, I want to be a kind, caring, creative human being when I grow up. They say, I want to be a doctor or I want to be a dancer. We're always defining ourselves by our work. And I had created this entire identity for myself over 5 years based on work and based on a business that at that point no longer existed. And that was the first time in my life that I can honestly say that I understood what depression felt like, because I just did not know. I mean, down to like if I was in a social situation and I met somebody new, I did not know how to introduce myself. And I couldn't say, well, I'm Andrea and I used to have a business, but now I don't. And now I just basically hide under the covers when I wake up in the morning and try not to interact with anyone. Which
that would not be a winner.
No.
Has small talk.
No, but that was the reality of what I was experiencing at that time. So I did have this huge identity crisis. And actually, I had had an identity crisis even before that in college, because I had gone to college originally to study vocal music performance. I wanted to be an opera singer, and I'd been singing my whole life. And I got into the School of Music and started taking classes and voice lessons there, and was really miserable. I really hated my freshman year of college so much. I was so miserable because studying music in an academic setting suddenly sucked all of the life and joy out of it for me. And I just was not having a great time, and I wanted to change it. I didn't want to be a music major anymore, but I had wanted to be that my entire life. And so there I was 18, and it was like this thing that I've wanted for the last 18 years of my life, I suddenly don't want. And now what? Now, what can I possibly do? And I ended up doing that thing where I just try on different hats. I changed my major, I think officially 3 times, but unofficially about 7 or 8 times in my mind. And I just kept trying things until I found something that was interesting to me. And that was in college, that ended up being broadcast communication with an emphasis in film and video production, which was not something I had ever considered before in my life. But I had taken a couple of classes in the communication department. My roommate was that major, and I liked her. And that way we could take classes together. And so I just tried it, and I ended up really liking it. And part of that training comes into what I'm doing now, but I didn't know that at the time. So I feel like identity, we get stuck in these identities that we create for ourselves based on what we do. And really, if we can say, okay, well, who am I based on who I am and how I do things, that gives us a clearer picture of identity than just based on what we do. So that I bring a lot of the same qualities and skills and personality traits to the way that I make a podcast as I do to the way I teach a yoga class, as I do to the way that I perform if I'm in a musical on stage. There are certain things that I do in a certain way and certain qualities and energies that I bring to the work that I'm doing, regardless of what work I'm actually doing. And that's, I think, a better way to get in touch with our own identities.
And that is where our worthiness lies. And I really just want to bring home that point, like that each and every one of us have qualities and gifts that only we embody in that way, that like no one else can do what you do the way Andrea does it. And that is so beautiful. And all of those elements that you bring to your life are what make you you and are what make you worthy all of the time, regardless of if your yoga studio closes or if you don't have as many listeners on your podcast or whatever it is, the thing that your inner mean girl has to say to you that day. Mm-hmm. And I love the way that you describe it. And I just want to point out to you, it's so interesting. I'm also, I have 2 music degrees, so I totally get the whole part of about music school and how that really changes your viewpoint. And I still am a professional musician, and I'm glad that I have those degrees. But what I see in what you're doing is this through line of using your voice. Mm-hmm. So you use your voice before when you were singing, and I'm sure that touched people. You use your voice now in your podcast. You use your voice in your yoga studio. So that gift of your voice, regardless of how you're using it, has been sort of the through line that has come through your life. And I really like to kind of identify that in my own life because it helps me see how all of these things that are seemingly disparate are actually related.
Totally. And this idea of a through line is so important as you live your life and as you build up experiences and, perhaps build up a body of work, depending upon, what you're spending your creative time and energy doing. You can start to see what the commonalities are between all of these different things, because the different identities that I've had, singer, filmmaker, writer, actor, podcaster, business owner, at first glance, it's like, whoa, what are these things? Like, this is a crazy amount of weird things that have nothing to do with each other. But if you can find that one unifying factor, and for somebody else, they could have those same experiences and they might have a different through line than mine, right? They might have
certainly will,
a different gift that is connecting the dots between all of those things. And then when you can figure out what that gift is, and a lot of times through, you've just said it to me, you're not the first person to say it to me. I wasn't the first person to think of that. I know it now because enough people I trust have said it to me.
Right.
But sometimes you need that external reflection to help you connect the dots so that you can explore that a little bit more deeply. And once you know what that gift and that through line is for you, that is really empowering to be able to give you the confidence to try on even more roles and even more creative identities, so that imposter voice becomes less of a threat for you.
Yeah, this is just so encouraging. I hope that you guys that are listening who sometimes feel confused by all of the desires you have that seem to not align with your current identity can really think of it like this. So when we identify those unique gifts and that through line, that opens up so many possibilities for us. Mm-hmm. And I just love the picture of that. It's almost like I can see sort of this very straight line, and then it's like a feather, like all these feathering lines coming off of it, that we could really go in any direction that our heart desires, and it will be the right direction.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask you one last question before we wrap up, and that is, what is your inner voice saying to you right now?
I've been having these whispering voices or thoughts coming into my mind recently during meditations or during coaching sessions that I've been doing, where I'm thinking about writing a book. And it's something that I've known that at some point I want to do. Like, it's on that big list of all the things I want to do in my life or want to create in my life. But I never really knew like when that was going to happen or what the book would be about. But I really keep seeing myself somewhere quiet, probably not in Chicago, not in my house, somewhere like writing and putting some of these thoughts and these experiences down on electronic paper. And there's something tugging at my... there's something internally that's saying that it's almost time to write this book.
Ooh, that is exciting. Mm-hmm. I can't wait to read it. Just let me know. Like, I'll be an early reader. Awesome. I'm happy to do that for you. So, Andrea, why don't you let my listeners know where they can find you, all of that yummy, juicy website, social media kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the podcast can be found on my website, which is thecreativeimpostor.com. You can find it on iTunes / Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, and Stitcher Radio as well. And on social, I have a Facebook community that anyone is welcome to request to join, and that's the Creative Impostor Facebook group. And also my Facebook page is andreaklunder.creative. And I'm Andrea Klunder on Instagram and on Twitter, technically, though I don't really spend much time on Twitter. So website, podcast, Facebook, Instagram are the best places to find me. Oh, and right now I have a free audio course for people who are wanting to dip their toes in and take a risk of any size. That's the How to Start Anything audio course. It's available complimentary right now at thecreativeimpostor.com/magic.
Cool. Well, I will definitely link to all of those things on the show notes page, which you guys can find at kellycovert.com/podcast. And you can go check out Andrea's stuff and follow her and just enjoy all of the juicy goodness that she has coming your way. So, Andrea, I just want to take a moment here to honor and acknowledge you for all that you're doing, for the risks that you're taking, and for your ability to show us how to show up and take those risks too. I think that work is so important and so needed right now. So thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you for everything that you are doing in the same way.
Thank you. And we will talk soon, my friend. Oh my goodness. so much goodness right there. I'm so glad that you guys made it all the way through, and I hope that you had some really valuable takeaways from that conversation with Andrea on creativity and risk-taking and identity. Oh my goodness. I'm so glad that you listened today. And if you really found yourself saying, yes, I feel that way sometimes, or that's a great idea, or nodding your head as you're driving your car, doing the dishes, I encourage you to share this with your girlfriends. Don't just keep this to yourself. Really help get the word out that we can all live by our inner voice, and we all have that inner wisdom inside of us to show us how to take risks, to help us know that we're loved and protected and that we're worthy while we do that. So you can share by hitting the share button in any podcast app that you use to listen to. And if you're listening to this at kellycovert.com, my website, then you can just copy that link and share it right on your Facebook page, or shoot it in an email to a good friend who you know could really benefit from this episode. And I so thank you for helping me spread the word. And I also want to let you know, if you are really finding value in her voice, if you're coming back to it week after week, knowing I am going to get something good today, that I'm going to be filled up today, that I'm going to have another tool to take away to apply in my life to really be living the life that I want, then I am asking you to join with me. Join with me by supporting In Her Voice through my Patreon page. You can find that at kellycovert.com/together. And that is just your way of saying, Kelly, thank you. You hear me, you see me, you know what I need. And I, in turn, say, thank you. Here is what I can do for you. Here is what I am creating for you right now in service of you. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting. As always, I want you to know that you matter. What you are creating in this world makes a difference, and we need you to shine so brightly. You are worthy.